They crawl inside quietly without warning, without asking permission, and they build something there. A feeling, a memory, a place you return to without even realizing you're going. Stevie Wonder has one of those voices. He has always had one of those voices. And for over 6 decades, the world has been returning to it again and again, because it is one of the very few sounds on this earth that makes ordinary life feel, somehow, larger than it actually is. He was always there, through the heartbreak and the celebration, through the quiet Sunday mornings when the house was still half asleep, through the loud Friday nights that nobody wanted to end, through first loves and last goodbyes and every complicated, beautiful, painful thing that falls somewhere in between. He was in the melody. He was in the groove. He was in that warmth that no one, not one single artist in all the years since, has ever been able to fully replicate. Not really, not in the way that mattered. And then something shifted. It didn't arrive like a headline. It didn't come with a press release or an announcement that prepared anyone for what it meant. It arrived the way loss usually does, slowly, softly, in the spaces between things. A cancelled show that people almost didn't notice. A public appearance that felt slightly different from the ones before it. A silence sitting exactly where there used to be sound. Fans started noticing. And then one by one they started worrying. Because when someone has given you that much of themselves, when their music has lived inside the most important moments of your life, the thought of losing them doesn't feel like celebrity news. It feels personal. It feels like something is being taken from you that you never had a proper name for, something you only understood you needed once you felt it beginning to slip. Reports began circulating, questions were raised about his health. And people who had carried his music in their hearts for 30, 40, 50 years found themselves sitting with a fear they couldn't quite bring themselves to say out loud. What if this is the beginning of something that doesn't turn around? What if the voice that carried a generation is reaching the edge of what it can carry? Nobody wants to ask that. But in the quiet, when the music comes on and lands a little differently than it used to, everybody is thinking it. To understand what is happening now, you have to first understand what Stevie Wonder actually means. Not as a name in a music catalog. Not as a collection of Grammy Awards or a spot in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But as a living, breathing presence that has existed in the background of people's everyday lives for so long that most of them have genuinely never known a world without him. He was born Stevland Hardaway Judkins in Saginaw, Michigan in 1950. He came into the world 6 weeks too early, small and fragile in ways that frightened everyone around him. The oxygen pumped into his incubator, meant to keep him alive, meant to give him a future, caused a condition called retinopathy of prematurity. It took his sight completely and permanently. He was blind before he ever had a single chance to see the world he had just arrived in. And yet, somehow, impossibly, he found a way to see everything. By the time he was 11 years old, he had already signed to Motown Records. 11 years old. While other children his age were worrying about schoolyard friendships and summer afternoons, and the small, consuming dramas of childhood. This boy from Michigan was standing inside a recording studio, holding a harmonica and producing sounds that stopped full-grown adults dead in their tracks. Sounds that didn't belong to someone that young, sounds that didn't belong to anyone ordinary. They called him Little Stevie Wonder. And the name was not a marketing invention, it was simply the most accurate description anyone could find. What he did was genuinely wondrous. There was no other honest word for it. But the story of a child prodigy is rarely as bright as the surface makes it seem. The music industry of the 1960s was not a gentle place. And it was especially ungentle to young black artists who had not yet learned how to protect themselves from the machinery built to profit off their gifts. Stevie grew up inside a system that took from him before he ever understood what he had. His early earnings were locked away in a trust he could not reach. His creative direction was shaped by executives who saw him as an asset long before they ever considered seeing him as a human being. He could have stayed in that position. He could have become the kind of story people reference in passing, the child star who flared brightly and then quietly faded into the margins of music history. He chose differently. When Stevie turned 21, he did something that almost no one in his position had ever done. He sat across from Motown Records and renegotiated everything. He demanded creative control, full and unconditional. He walked away from the safety of a guaranteed career because he knew, somewhere deep and unshakable inside himself, that he had far more to say and that he had earned the right to say it entirely on his own terms. What came next was something the music world had never quite seen before and has never fully seen since. Between 1972 and 1976, he released 5 albums, one after another: Music of My Mind, Talking Book, Innervisions, Fulfillingness, First Finale, and songs in the key of life that didn't just top charts. They permanently, irreversibly expanded what popular music was allowed to be. Critics reached for words and found them insufficient. Other musicians, some of them giants in their own right, simply went quiet and listened. Because sometimes the only honest response to something that transcendent is silence. This was not someone resting on natural talent. This was someone burning with purpose. Someone who had something urgent to say and a gift so extraordinary that the world had no real choice but to stop everything and listen. For the decades that followed, Stevie Wonder remained a constant in a world that was constantly changing. He evolved without losing himself. He performed at presidential inaugurations and at funerals, and at stadium concerts that left audiences breathless, and at small, quiet benefit shows where he simply wanted to help. He stood publicly and consistently for civil rights, for racial dignity, for the idea that music carries a kind of humanity across every border that fear and politics try to build. He was more than a musician. He was a reminder, steady, generous, and enduring, of what human beings are truly capable of when they commit themselves completely to something larger than personal ambition. Which is why, when the first real signs of concern began to surface, the silence that followed felt so impossibly loud. For a long time after the peak of his creative fire, Stevie Wonder was simply present. And presence, when it belongs to someone like him, is its own kind of gift. He wasn't releasing albums at the relentless pace of his earlier years. He wasn't chasing charts or trying to recapture the particular energy of his 1970s run. He had more than earned the right to move at a different speed in a different way. And he did. He moved through the world with the ease of someone who had already proven everything he needed to prove, and was now free to simply exist in music rather than fight for his place within it. He appeared at tribute concerts, lending that voice, that irreplaceable, unmistakable voice, to the celebration of other artists' legacies. He showed up at award ceremonies, sometimes to perform, sometimes simply to speak, and when he spoke, something interesting happened. Rooms went quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for someone to finish. A real quiet, the kind that falls over people when they sense they are in the presence of something genuinely rare. People who were fortunate enough to see him live during this period often describe the same experience afterward. They had come expecting nostalgia. They had come to be reminded of songs they already loved. What they left with was something different, the distinct, almost startling sense that they had witnessed something still alive. Something that had not dulled with the years. The voice was still there, carrying that warmth, still able to phrase a single note in a way that completely bypassed rational thought and landed somewhere far deeper. Somewhere closer to the center of a person. There were quiet rumors, circulating warmly through fan communities, that he was working on new music, that a long-awaited album was slowly taking shape somewhere behind closed studio doors. Fans who had been waiting years, some of them genuinely decades, let themselves believe it, because that is what Stevie Wonder has always done to people. He makes believing feel reasonable. He makes hope feel like the right response. There were public appearances where he seemed entirely himself, full of energy, full of that particular humor that has always been part of who he is. Full of the lightness that somehow coexists in him alongside such profound depth. His laugh in interviews had a quality to it that is difficult to describe without sounding slightly ridiculous. It felt like a chord resolving, complete, satisfying, genuinely real. Nobody was worried, not in any serious way. Why would they be? He had already survived things that would have broken most people irreparably. A premature birth that nearly cost him everything. A lifetime of navigating the world without sight. A music industry designed to extract from him rather than support him. And then, in 1973, a near-fatal car accident. A collision so devastating that it left him in a coma for 4 full days. And the neurological damage was significant enough that his sense of smell never fully returned. He survived that. He came back from that particular darkness and made some of the most beautiful music of his entire career. Stevie Wonder had always somehow found his way through. The idea that something could now truly and fundamentally threaten him, that the body which had carried that voice for over 70 years might be reaching a point of real and genuine fragility, felt almost impossible to hold in the mind. Almost, there is no single moment anyone can point to as the turning point. No one date that explains when concern became something heavier. It happened the way these things always do, gradually, quietly. Through an accumulation of small things that each seemed explainable on its own, but together began to form a shape that people recognized without wanting to name. Performances that were announced and then quietly, without much explanation, postponed. Public appearances where something felt slightly different from what audiences had grown accustomed to, nothing dramatic, nothing that would stand alone as headline news. But enough of a difference that people who had been watching him for years noticed it. Enough that conversations began opening up in fan communities and comment sections, conversations that start gently with concern, and then tip into something closer to fear before anyone fully notices the shift has happened. According to reports that had begun circulating in the years before the matter became more widely discussed, Stevie Wonder had been managing significant health challenges. The specifics, as reported, centered on his kidneys. Kidney disease is not a simple or contained condition. It reaches into multiple aspects of a person's daily life: their energy, their cognitive function, their physical endurance, their overall experience of being in the world. It is the kind of illness that is often invisible from the outside, even when it is deeply present on the inside. For someone whose entire public life has been built around performance, around showing up fully, and giving an audience everything, the impact of that kind of illness carries implications that go far beyond the purely physical. In 2019, Stevie himself stepped forward and addressed his health publicly. He confirmed that he had received a kidney transplant. He spoke about it the way he speaks about most things, with warmth, with a quiet humor that made the room feel slightly less heavy, with reassurance. He was going to be all right, he told people. He had plans to return, the music was not finished, and people exhaled, genuinely, because that is what happens when Stevie Wonder tells you it is going to be okay. Something in you simply believes him, but recovery from a kidney transplant is not a straight line. It is not a problem that gets solved and then set aside. It is an ongoing process of adjustment, of the body slowly learning a new way to function, of medical management that continues long after the surgery itself. It is especially complex when the person recovering is in their 70s, with a health history that has its own particular layers of complication. The question that began surfacing quietly at first, and then with more frequency, was whether the life Stevie had lived before, the performing life, the public life of sustained and enormous presence, was fully available to him still. Whether the new normal his body was learning had room in it for all of that. No one outside his inner circle could answer that with any certainty. But the question itself, once it was in the air, didn't leave. What makes this story genuinely hard to sit with is not the medical reality on its own. Medical realities are facts. They can be processed, at least partially, through information and understanding. What is harder to process is the emotional architecture built around those facts. Because Stevie Wonder is not simply a public figure navigating a health challenge. He is someone who has spent the entirety of his adult life, and most of his childhood, in an act of profound giving. He gave his music to the world with a generosity that has very few real parallels. And the world received it not casually but deeply, personally, in ways that became woven into the fabric of individual lives. That relationship between Stevie Wonder and the people who love his music is not a fan and celebrity relationship in any conventional sense. It is closer to something like a covenant, a mutual thing. He gave something real, and people received it as real, and that creates a bond that doesn't dissolve simply because time passes or circumstances change. When an artist with that kind of relationship to his audience goes quiet, even partially, even temporarily, the absence is felt in a very specific way. It is not the absence of entertainment. It is the absence of something that people have built parts of their inner lives around without fully realizing they were doing it. Consider what his music has meant concretely in actual human lives. There are people who grew up with superstition shaking through their parents' car speakers on the way to school, who cannot hear those opening bars now without traveling back to something they can't entirely locate. There are people who heard "Isn't She Lovely" at a family celebration, a birth, a wedding, a simple Sunday afternoon, and felt something inside them physically rearrange. There are couples who chose "You Are the Sunshine of My Life" as their song and have heard it layered with 30 years of shared memory ever since. These are not passing relationships with music. These are foundational ones. the kind that reveal themselves most clearly at moments of loss or joy, when the ordinary scaffolding of daily life falls away and what remains is simply what has always mattered. When reports continued surfacing, sometimes specific, sometimes frustratingly vague, suggesting that his health remained a genuine and ongoing concern even following the transplant. The response from the people who loved him was not the response of fans consumed by celebrity gossip. It was love expressing itself in the only direction available to it when it cannot reach its object. It expressed itself as fear. Tributes began appearing online. Not the tributes that arrive after a loss, a different kind, something more anticipatory, something more quietly painful. The kind where people begin saying the things they have always meant to say, but kept waiting for the right moment to say them. Because something in the air is suggesting that the window for saying them might not stay open indefinitely. There were also careful, gentle questions raised by people close to the situation, by those who understood what his former life of large-scale touring and performance had actually demanded of him physically, about whether those demands remained realistic. Performing at the level Stevie Wonder performs is not a small thing. It requires physical endurance that is difficult to sustain in perfect health. The preparation, the travel, the sustained concentration and energy of standing before thousands of people and channeling something that powerful night after night. No official conclusion has been reached about the shape of his future in live performance, but the questions themselves carry genuine weight, and that weight doesn't sit only with him. It sits with everyone who loves him and is trying to figure out how to hold the uncertainty with some measure of grace. Something that tends to disappear inside conversations like this one is the actual person at the center of it, the man, not the icon. Stevie Wonder when the cameras are off and the music has stopped, and he is simply himself in a room. By every account that exists from the people who have known him, collaborators, family members, people who have worked alongside him across many decades of music and life, he is genuinely, consistently warm. Not warm in the careful, managed way of someone protecting a public image, warm in the real way, the kind of warmth that does not require witnesses. The kind that exists whether or not anyone is looking. He is a father several times over, and someone who has spoken about fatherhood with an openness that makes clear it is not peripheral to who he is but central to it. He is someone with a deep and personal faith, a spirituality that has informed his music from the very beginning, and that has clearly served as a source of genuine sustenance through the hardest chapters of his life, including this one. He is someone who has always believed, without apparent irony or performance, that love is the most radical thing available to human beings. His music has argued that case song after song, decade after decade, in ways that never once sounded naive coming from him. It has always sounded earned. Like a conclusion that cost something to reach. Like something he believed not because it was comforting, but because life had actually taught him it was true. When he spoke publicly about the kidney transplant and about his intentions to recover and return, there was a quality to how he spoke that people found genuinely steadying. Not because he made it sound easy, he didn't pretend it was easy. But because he approached it from a place of acceptance rather than resistance, from a kind of settled stillness that is not the same as resignation. It is something harder to achieve than that, and something that reveals a great deal about the interior life of a man who has clearly done real and sustained work on himself over a very long lifetime. But those around him and the millions watching from a distance are allowed to feel things he may be too gracious to express publicly. They are allowed to be afraid. They are allowed to hope with the particular fierceness that comes from loving someone's work so much that the thought of the world without them in it becomes genuinely difficult to imagine. They are allowed to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, because not knowing is simply the honest position when someone's health is this complex and this private. According to reports and observations from those who have encountered him in more recent public appearances, his spirit remains entirely present. The warmth, the humor, the particular quality of attention he gives to people around him, none of that has dimmed. But a spirit and a body are two separate things, and sometimes the story one is telling is different from the story the other can support. There is a particular kind of grief that exists without a name. It is not the grief that arrives after a loss. That grief, as terrible as it is, has a shape. It has a before and an after, a moment of rupture that, however devastating, provides at least the grim clarity of knowing where you stand. This other grief is different. It is anticipatory. It lives in the space between what is still true and what might eventually change. It is the grief of watching someone you love begin to age in ways that remind you, quietly but insistently, that they are mortal. That the presence you have always taken as permanent is in fact contingent, subject to biology, subject to time. It is harder to carry in some ways because it exists alongside hope. Because nothing has been confirmed. Because there is still the possibility, real and reasonable, that he has more to give, more to create, more of himself to offer the world. People are still waiting for the music. The long-rumored album that Stevie has mentioned in interviews across many years, sometimes with something approaching a specific promise, sometimes with a vaguer suggestion of what is coming, remains a source of genuine longing for the people who believe, not irrationally, that there is still more he has to say. That the story is not finished, that there is at least one more chapter that belongs to him to write, and perhaps there is. The history of music is not short on artists who found unexpected wells of creativity late in their lives, who believed themselves to have said everything and then discovered something new waiting beneath the surface. Artists who produced final chapters that surprised even themselves. But the conversation happening now is not only about whether there will be more music. It has become about something larger than that. It has become about legacy, about what fills the space that a person like Stevie Wonder occupies in the cultural imagination when the active phase of their presence begins to slow. It has become about whether a voice, even one preserved in thousands of recordings, even one that will exist on servers and streaming platforms long after every human being currently alive has gone, can ever be truly preserved in the way that actually matters. Because what made his music feel alive was never only the notes themselves. It was the knowledge that somewhere the person who made those sounds was still in the world, still breathing, still finding reasons to believe that love was worth singing about, still, in some fundamental sense, present. That sense of continued presence changes how the music feels when you listen to it. And when that presence becomes uncertain, something in the listening changes too. Questions have been raised gently and seriously about what Stevie himself wants from this chapter of his life. Whether he still feels the pull toward performance and creation. Whether he is moving toward something new, or whether he is perhaps arriving at a place where stillness is not something to resist, but something to receive. No one outside his closest circle can answer that, and perhaps not even all of them can. What is clear without any ambiguity is that the love directed at him from around the world, from millions of people across every continent, every language, every generation that his music has touched, is sitting in a state of suspended tenderness right now. A love that has no obvious place to go and so simply remains, present, patient, waiting, hoping. There is something Stevie Wonder said once that tends to stay with the people who heard it. He said that music at its very best is a conversation between the person who creates it and the person who receives it. A conversation that travels across time, across distance, across all the ordinary separations that life places between people. A conversation that does not require both participants to be in the same room or even in the same era. He was right about that. He has been right about a great many things over the course of a long and extraordinary life. The recordings exist, and they will continue to exist. The performances preserved on film and tape and in digital archives exist, and they are not going anywhere. Songs in the key of life will outlast most structures that human hands have built. Higher ground will be playing somewhere on this earth long after every person currently breathing has taken their last breath. The music is not at risk. The music is permanent in ways that very little human creation actually manages to be. But recordings are not the same as presence. They are not the same as the living, breathing, laughing, feeling human being who made them. And what the people who love Stevie Wonder are really grappling with right now, beneath all the reports and the health updates and the questions about future performances, is not the fear of losing his music. That cannot be taken from anyone. It is the fear of losing him, the actual person, the laugh that resolves like a chord, the warmth that exists whether or not anyone is looking. The sense that somewhere in the world, the man who sang those words is still present, still feeling them, still believing in everything he put into them. That is the grief living underneath the headlines. That is what fills the comment sections with long, careful, surprisingly tender messages from people who would probably not describe themselves as the kind of people who write long, careful, surprisingly tender messages. That is what happens when a familiar song comes on and lands in a slightly different place, than it always did before. Stevie Wonder has given the world something that a very small number of human beings across all of recorded history have ever managed to give. Not just songs, not just an impressive catalog, but a feeling, a sustained, open-handed, decades-long offering of his interior world to anyone willing to stop and receive it. He made vulnerability look natural. He made joy look like something genuinely earned, and therefore genuinely real. He made love sound like the most reasonable conclusion a person could arrive at, rather than a comfortable illusion. Whatever comes next, more music, more public presence, a slower and quieter chapter than the ones that came before. Or something that none of us have yet thought to anticipate, his place in the human story is not in question. It has never been in question, and nothing that happens now will change it. What is simply humanly uncertain, and what makes all of this feel so tender, is how much time remains to say thank you while he can still hear it. That urgency. That particular kind of love that finally understands it is not guaranteed. That quiet, aching hope that it is not too late to say, you mattered, you still matter. In ways you gave us and ways we made ourselves, in kitchens and cars and hospital waiting rooms and moments of joy we never wanted to end, you were there. You are still there. And we are not ready to let that go. If this story moved something in you, if Stevie Wonder's music has ever found you at exactly the right moment and stayed, take a moment in the comments to share what that was. Not the general appreciation, the specific memory, the song that arrived when you needed it, the moment it meant something you couldn't have put into words yourself. Those stories matter. They are the real proof of what music does when it is made by someone who means every word of it. And if you want more stories told this way, with care, with honesty, with the patience these subjects deserve, subscribe and stay close. There are more worth telling.